It was the political establishment that sought to historicize the Jesus figure for social control. By 325 AD in Rome, Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea. It was during this meeting that the politically motivated Christian doctrines were established, and thus began a long history of Christian bloodshed and spiritual fraud. And for the next 1600 years, the Vatican maintained a political stranglehold on all of Europe, leading to such joyous periods as the Dark Ages, along with enlightening events such as the Crusades and the Inquisition.
Regarding Constantine, Dr. Ben Witherington III writes, "What then did Emperor Constantine have to do with all of this process? Constantine ruled as Roman emperor from about AD 313 to 337. The truth of the matter is that he didn't take full control of the empire before 324, or very shortly before the Council of Nicaea. This fact alone should make evident that most theological issues, including those about Christ's nature, had taken a rather definite shape and trajectory before Constantine had anything to do with them. At the Council of Nicaea, Constantine seems to have favored Christ's true divinity, but he was no theologian, and it certainly wasn't he who wrote the Creed of Nicaea, nor can it be said that he determined the canon. Constantine mainly pronounced the benediction on the deliberations that had already been formulated. Zeitgeist is correct about the Roman Catholic Church's long history of bloodshed throughout the Dark Ages, the Crusades, and the Inquisition. However, these facts do not negate the credibility of Christianity, but rather demonstrate the sinfulness of man. Regardless of how later professing Christians behaved, Jesus taught his followers to love all people, including their enemies, and to remain peaceful with all people at all costs. Violence, bloodshed, and spiritual fraud in the name of Jesus does not come from the Bible, nor does the New Testament condone such events. Anybody who reads the New Testament for themselves will see that violent Christians live contrary to what the Bible teaches, and are therefore not followers of Jesus at all. As presented earlier, there are numerous non-biblical historians who speak of Jesus. Thus, it was not the political establishment that sought to historicize Jesus. This is not to say that the Bible has not been perverted and taken out of context by the political elite for social control throughout history and even today. In the secret FEMA plan to use pastors as pacifiers in preparation for martial law, this debriefing tells pastors to help implement FEMA and Homeland Security directives. FEMA directors told pastors to preach specific passages to their congregations like Romans 13. The Bible passage often taken out of context by dictators like Hitler to hoodwink Christians into supporting him. While the Bible teaches in Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 that God has given law enforcement officials of worldly governments the right to enforce penalties of crimes and to go to war against other nations, this is not a Christian duty. The Bible does not teach Christians blind submission to authority, but in many cases to resist the ordained powers in order to obey what God has commanded. If the state's orders are in conflict to Jesus' teachings, including murder, war, idolatry, etc., then resistance to those powers is obedience to God. Zeitgeist's argument is invalid because there are several examples of civil disobedience in the Bible. For example, Daniel chapter 3 documents a few of the Hebrews' unwillingness to compromise the commandments of God in submission to the Babylonian Empire. Exodus chapter 1 speaks of the Hebrew midwives who refused to obey the Egyptian Empire's commands to kill male babies, and Joshua chapter 2 documents the harlot Rahab who housed the Hebrew spies and hid them from the authorities. The book of Acts is full of examples of how the apostles of the early Christian church disobeyed the Jewish authorities in order to preach the gospel. Peter taught to obey God rather than men. Though the Christ myth theory, also known as the Jesus myth, is not original, it is very recent, historically speaking. The antecedents of the theory can be traced directly back to French Enlightenment thinkers Constantin François Volney and Charles François Dupuy in the 1790s. Proponents and authors cited in the Zeitgeist transcript have recently repopularized the theory. The questioning of Jesus' existence is not accepted by mainstream scholarship, as stated by Richard Burridge and Graham Gould in their book Jesus Now and Then, page 34. Michael Grant states on page 199 of his book Jesus, an Historian's Review of the Gospels, that the Jesus myth thesis fails to satisfy modern critical methodology and is rejected by all but a few scholars. Graham N. Stanton writes, "Today nearly all historians, whether Christians or not, accept that Jesus existed and that the Gospels contain plenty of valuable evidence which has to be weighed and assessed critically. There is general agreement that with the possible exception of Paul, we know far more about Jesus of Nazareth than about any 1st or 2nd century Jewish or pagan religious teacher." James Charlesworth sums it up. "No reputable scholar today questions that a Jew named Jesus, son of Joseph, lived. Most readily admit that we know a considerable amount about his actions and basic teachings." Jonathan Z. Smith, who contributed to the entry Dying and Rising Gods for the Encyclopedia of Religion, said, "The category of dying and rising gods, once a major topic of scholarly investigation, must now be understood to have been largely a misnomer based on imaginative reconstructions in exceedingly late or highly ambiguous texts. The category of dying and rising deities is exceedingly dubious. It has been based largely on Christian interest and tenuous evidence. As such, the category is of more interest to the history of scholarship than to the history of religions." Even liberal scholar Thomas Bosluper acknowledges, "Contemporary writers invariably use only secondary sources to verify such claims. The scholars whose judgment they accept rarely produced or quoted the primary sources." Yet Zeitgeist and its sources continue to propagate this theory in spite of all the evidence. In Part 1 of the film Zeitgeist, nearly 200 sources are cited in the transcript, yet many of these sources are used more than once and none of them predate Christianity. For example, D.M. Murdoch, who also goes by the pen name Acharya S, is cited 29 times, and Gerald Massey is cited 30 times. The Bible is cited 22 times, almost always with erroneous conclusions. In fact, when the transcript for this film is examined in further detail, we see that less than 25% of these sources are original. Like the French Enlightenment thinkers, Sir James Frazer, cited 4 times in Zeitgeist, wrote The Golden Bough in 1890 when these mystery religions were still mysteries. It is from his work and others that Gerald Massey and Acharya S get much of their information. However, Frazer's pioneering work has come under criticism by more recent scholars. When the newly accumulated archaeological and textual evidence is consulted, his ideas are no longer valid. Professor of history at Miami University, Dr. Edwin Yamauchi stated, "On the popular level, Sir James Frazer gathered a mass of parallels in his multi-volume work called The Golden Bough, which was published in 1906. He discussed Osiris of Egypt, Adonis of Syria, Attis of Asia Minor, and Tammuz of Mesopotamia, and concluded that there was a common rising and dying fertility god. Unfortunately, much of his work was based on a misreading of evidence." In 1970, John Allegro, another of Zeitgeist sources, wrote a book entitled The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. He proposes that the earliest Christians were actually a secret cult group that used hallucinogenic mushrooms and utilized the name Jesus as a code word to avoid letting outsiders know about their secret activities. Allegro was criticized immediately by almost every major historical scholar. The Times newspaper of London printed a letter signed by 15 scholars in the Semitic languages who dismissed his conclusions, stating that it was not based on any philological or other evidence that they can regard as scholarly. And what about this amulet of Dionysus as a crucified figure pictured and dated 500 BC in Zeitgeist? Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy, cited 7 times in the film, feature a picture of the amulet on the cover of their book, The Jesus Mysteries. The Zeitgeist claim that this amulet dates back to 500 BC is a lie. Actually, the amulet dates centuries after the 1st century AD, after the establishment of Christianity. One researcher, James Hannum, documented, "Although it features on the cover of the Jesus Mysteries, Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy are actually quite circumspect about the amulet in the text. I emailed them to ask in which book they had found it. Peter Gandy kindly replied that it was in the 2nd edition of Guthrie's Orpheus and the Greek Religion, as well as R. Eisler's Orpheus the Fisher, first published in 1920. Oddly enough, it isn't in the appendix of either of these books. On my next visit to London, I looked both these books up at the Warburg Institute and found the note in Guthrie's work that the amulet was believed to be a fake. In subsequent email correspondence through an intermediary, Peter Gandy eventually came clean. I will quote in full. "I have to admit that James Hannam is correct. Kern's comment is indeed in Guthrie's book. In sum, not only is the amulet shown in the film Zeitgeist and on the cover of the Jesus Mysteries a fake, but at least one author of the book knew it was a fake and kept quiet about it until now. This displays the dishonesty of Zeitgeist's Freak and Gandy, discrediting their researching abilities."
First, let me say something about Freak and Gandy's book. I do not recommend that book. I would prefer that no one ever read it. It's only marginally better than Kersey Graves' work. Their research is on key parts, it's shoddy, and their source citations minimal and problematic. There's no way to know when they've gotten something right or wrong without redoing all their research, which makes their book useless. And that's the same complaint I had against Graves' book. To figure out what's in there that's even correct, you have to completely redo the whole work, and why even read the book if you're just going to do all the work yourself anyway?
Edward Carpenter is cited 8 times, but is hardly a qualified expert in our current inquiry, but was a socialist poet, philosopher, and early gay activist in the late 1800s. Thomas Doane is cited 19 times in Zeitgeist for his work Bible Myths and Parallels in Other Religions. One researcher responds, in chapter 28, page 282 of Doane's book, he asserts the things you mention about the parallels between Jesus and Krishna, or Krishna, as he spells it. He gives the appearance of documenting his assertions about Krishna being crucified and resurrected, for example, in extensive footnotes. But when you check out the footnotes, each one refers not to an original document for its basis, but to another chapter in the same book. In the case of the critical for Christian's assertion, the Resurrection, chapter 23, he then documents his statements about Krishna on page 215 in yet another footnote, this time again not to original documents of any kind, but to other scholars' books, Higgins' Anacalypsis and Asiatic Researches. I was able to find the Asiatic Researches and could only find one sentence there in which the author unknown simply referred, almost as a passing thought, to Krishna having died and returned to his heavenly seat. What kind of argument, much less evidence or proof, is that? Clearly, Doane is making wild and imaginative assertions here. Acharya S, author of The Christ Conspiracy, was the consultant for Zeitgeist. However, when one examines Acharya's bibliographical material, it is proven to be a ripoff from the material from earlier authors cited in the Zeitgeist transcript. Some of Acharya's most cited material comes from The World's 16 Crucified Saviors by Kersey Graves. Any allegations of 16 other saviors who all resemble the same characteristics of Jesus is most likely based on this book. However, this book is an unreliable source. Even atheist Richard Carrier criticized, "The World's 16 Crucified Saviors is unreliable, but no comprehensive critique exists." Most scholars immediately recognize many of his findings as unsupported and dismiss Graves as useless. After all, a scholar who rarely cites a source isn't useful to have as a reference even if he is right.